Good afternoon and welcome to the Art History Festival. My name is Christina Bradstreet. I'm the head of programmes for the Association for Art History, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our Art History Festival, a week of events celebrating art history local to global. The festival is organised by the Association for Art History and is taking place across the UK and beyond in partnership with museums and galleries and other cultural institutions, with events happening both online and in person. We have about 90 events and 80 partners taking place for this festival this week, which runs right through to Sunday. There's lots more still to come. I'm really delighted that we're able to have this talk today on the development of Mowaa, the Museum of West African Art in Nigeria, and the Mowaa Institute in particular. So thank you for being with us this afternoon, and I will hand over now to B. Gaspin de Souza, one of our association members, who will be introducing our speaker, Ore Disu, and a bit more about her talk. Welcome, B.
Hi, Christina. Hello, audience. It's lovely to see you here. I'm looking forward to introducing Ora, I think, who will appear, Ora Disu, who will appear on screen in a minute. We'll just give it a minute. Hi, Ora. I'm so very pleased to introduce you because I met you in Lagos almost a decade ago. And even then, you were an activist for Nigerian history and memorization with a forward-thinking, self-initiated digital platform in Nsibidi Institute. For the global audience, Nsibidi is the name of southeastern Nigerian proto writing used by the so-called Ekpe society in very, very short, a community-embedded judicial system. Ora's vision then was to support research, preserve heritage, and to revive Nigerian knowledge creation. So with such an experience in sustaining a historical memory project, she's incredibly well placed to lead the new Edo Museum of West African Art Research Campus, Mowaa, in Benin City. It is poignantly located in the former grounds of the 13th century Benin palatial quarters. The palace, an architectural marvel, which was not only completely looted but also erased by fire during the British invasion in 1897, is not only central to Nigerian national memory, but also subject to forceful European debates. Here we can think of Dan Hicks' very frank 2020 book, The British Museums, the Benin Bronzes, Colonial Violence and Cultural Restitution, and Digital Benin, the German restitutional effort initiated by Dr. Barbara Plankensteiner of the Mark Ethnographic Museum in Hamburg, who's currently involved in an advisory capacity in the Mowaa team. So jointly, Ore Disu, I believe the archaeologist Adebayo Folorunso, the art historian and lead curator Andrea Emelife, as well as the renowned scholar of Nigerian post-colonial modernism Chika Okeke Agulu, are part of the team energizing the foundational research into historical and contemporary Nigerian art and the materiality of artifacts in the Edo-Nigerian context. Now, this Edo context, I just sort of want to highlight that a little bit, is the foundation of the archaeologist Folorunso's methods of ethnoarchaeology, which is groundbreaking fieldwork regarding the interpretation of archaeological records of an extinct culture, or almost extinct culture, and historical archaeology suited to reimagine the architectural and artistic modernity of the Benin Kingdom with its international influence and links from the 13th century onward. And just to offer an example, some incredible facts for the European Renaissance buffs amongst the audience, the Edo dynasties in the 15th and 16th centuries chose to import infinitely valuable corals from the Italian Mediterranean Sea for the opulent royal jewelry and court attire. And because the deep, more bluish red was preferred over the more locally available Cameroonian yellowish ochre-colored corals. So this little vignette of a history of contact mapped from a continental African perspective will yield amazing new insights, which will undoubtedly transform arts histories. And, we all know that digital technology and site access with the aid of drones can yield more data, which will change the depth of what can be reimagined today. And the Mowaa Institute itself, which Ore Disu leads and which she will introduce with her vision, will serve as a catalyst for deepening connections between contemporary arts and culture and the rich culture of West Africa. It is designed to be a center of excellence and to create opportunities for African and diasporic artists and scholars. It has a new infrastructure, which also interestingly includes guest houses to facilitate on-site learning and to build a world-class campus in the heart of the historic district of the established Nigerian university town of Benin City. The ongoing restitution negotiations, which we can never get away from, will ensure that this arts institution is based on a future-oriented growth model with the potential not only for equity, but also global leadership. Mowaa has platforms for display, interaction, and commerce. It is an expanding hub with multiple buildings and an ambitious multi-year plan. And this first building, the Mowaa Institute, designed by David Adjaye Associates, will celebrate its completion on November 4th, very, very soon this year, with 2 days of events. And this is leading me over to introducing Aura with her vision. The theme of this is Museum in the Making, rediscovering a West African identity, philosophy, and practice. Now, Aura, please share with us your thoughts and your visions for Mowaa, which is an incredible task.
Thank you so much, Bia, for the very glowing review. And I think really helping to set the tone and contextualize what we're doing at Mowaa, but also I think the real importance of what we are seeing happening right now, not just in Nigeria, but in different parts of the world where there has been a refocusing, I would say, on Black culture, Black identity, and a need to, I think, really think hard and articulate what happens in terms of a longer term approach to how we are reinterpreting cultural material, as well as promoting not just the conservation of works and their return, but also the longer term promotion of new arts and culture. So thank you very much. I think what I'll do is share my screen. Just give me 1 second. Great. Can I just maybe confirm that others can see my screen? Okay,
Well, I
great.
can, yes.
So when I was approached by the Art History Festival team to give some, to share some of my experience, one of the things that immediately came to mind was my own starting place as I suppose I would call it a cultural practitioner, just to keep the term relatively broad. And it really has been centered around something that might not look like a typical scene for many of those around the room who are more used to thinking about culture from the perspective of a museum. But for me, it was within the context of the city as the setting for which culture emerges, is sustained, and is constantly interacted with. This actually draws from a project that I conducted just a year before joining and leading the Incivity Institute. And this was set really in a highly dense part of Lagos City, in Alimosho, where you had a series of thick bus parks and marketplaces. And I refer to this not just because it points to where I started on my journey and how my training as an architect and community development practitioner has fed into what I now do within the remit of Mowaa, but also to talk about the way in which space and society are always in interplay, even when it comes to broader global landscapes and issues such as the starting point of restitution that Bia raised earlier in the conversation, but also in terms of history and how in contextualizing or seeking to recontextualize and provide for interpretive platforms for cultural material in Nigeria, that you inevitably have to deal with the contemporary status quo. Moving. So this is just showing more of that project, which again focused on it was a public lighting scheme. And the I think interesting thing about this was really being conscious about how even just a small change on reference starts to build connection, starts to promote conversations and a rethinking or reuse of public space, creates moments of play, but also can provide a way for people from different walks of life to actually be involved in reshaping space. And I think this marries very much into what we've been thinking about at Mowaa, which is really the role of arts institutions in shaping the urban realm. And from our perspective, there have been a series of questions that we've been asking as we set up to not just think about conservation practice, but to actually design a campus that would actually speak to notions of identity, but could also go beyond the objects themselves to provide opportunities for visitors, for residents to reconnect with their heritage. And just to provide broader context, this has been done as part of an initiative that I've been fortunate to be part of called the Museum of West African Art, which is really trying to provide a transformative platform, starting in Benin City, but really with a regional perspective to support the expansion of knowledge and creativity, to provide the facilities that would support training, research, and the development of new cultural forms, but also to provide a way to link not just what's happening in Nigeria and other parts of West Africa, but to the global diaspora. And so when you're thinking about what the setting should be for this mandate, one of the things that we were immediately very aware of was the historic nature and the vibrancy of the site where Mowaa is located. So this is a bird's eye view of the emerging campus, which is a 15-acre complex in downtown Benin City, in an area that formerly would have been part of the medieval inner palace compound in the Benin Empire. So this is, again, the heart of what really stood for the Edo culture, for the center of power, but also of trade. It's also a space that, as you can see, has morphed and transitioned over time. It was also the base for colonial British administration at the time that Nigeria, as with many other African countries, was under British rule. So it is a complex area to be working with. It is in some ways a charged landscape. And of course, in addition to this, it's a space that, as with a lot of Nigerian cities, has a high urban young population with a high degree of unemployment. So again, when you're thinking about interventions into this space, there are questions with regards to how do you link to the local economic development? How are we supporting urban regeneration efforts? How can we mirror or reference the history and the trajectory of development, the materiality, the ecology? And these were questions that I think were very much at the forefront of our thoughts as we've sought to shape an approach to the development of the campus. This is just a render that shows what it would look like at completion. Again, referencing the range of buildings, but also the very persistent approach to expand not just buildings, but create a series of interwoven urban public spaces and green spaces. And I would say that when it came to our approach, there were four main entry points, if you will. One was to see design as a form of advocacy, as a form of asserting cultural identity, as a way to not just look at like designing a building for the purpose of having big institutional presence, but really demonstrating that traditional and indigenous forms of thinking about space and creating buildings are still very much relevant for how we think about contemporary building techniques as well as materiality. Secondly, as an arts and heritage management institution, I think the importance of embedding conservation practices into our building approach has been front and center, in particular because of where the site is located. Anything that you dig up could potentially be relevant from a sort of cultural informational standpoint. But it's also, I think, a way to highlight the importance of African practitioners. And one of the things that Bia also mentioned was the fact that this is a university city. There are a range of different cultural research practitioners and centers that have been doing the hard work of keeping heritage alive and protected, oftentimes without much by way of either financial or even to an extent regulatory support. So how can we, by stepping into this space, demonstrate that we are being responsible as a cultural institution, but also hopefully paving the way for other smaller entities and individual practitioners to do more with their practice. So again, really about exemplary practice. Thirdly, we were very conscious that this is not a journey that we should experience in a siloed manner, but as much as possible to provide avenues for learning and exchange. I'll come to that later in terms of the various channels through which this was done and the degree of experimentation and in some ways some painful practical stretches that it took to actually get us to the point where we are today. And fourth, I would say that, and the relevance of Mowaa in the wider landscape, it would be to serve as an amplifier for really supporting the revival of more traditional forms of artisanship. So really thinking about the way in which your building itself could have elements, whether it's doorknobs, whether it's door frames, even thinking about how you make signage into the space. How are we doing this in a manner that could actually keep the living heritage alive? So I'll just maybe quickly blitz through this. But in the first instance, across the campus, we have really sought a blend of architects from Nigeria and Senegal who understand our ethos and have, to an extent, a research-based approach to how they think things that this has led to on this building on the screen, which is the Mowaa Institute, taken about, I think, June earlier this year, is that we are really pushing ourselves hard to integrate materials that typically have been considered as being in some ways less glamorous or less important, as we partly from due to influence of more Western forms of architecture, but also because there has been such a decline in mud wall architecture. It's harder to maintain. It requires a degree of hands-on practice, but it very much is, it does fall into a tradition of environmental sustainability to the extent that these are materials that are all locally available, and can be consciously sourced and used over time. And if you were to visit Benin, or if you were fortunate to have time traveling skills and capabilities and had visited Benin in the 16th century, much of what you would have seen would have been mud architecture. And so again, looking at ways that we reference, but still have innovations to keep this a contemporary space, was very much part of what we are pushing for and promoting as a practice. And this went all the way through into thinking about the pairing of the rammed earth with colored concrete to ensure that we, again, do carbon heavy material. This is some other views of the interior structure. But I think what much of this speaks to a rigor of the design team, but also to mirror and amplify what might be considered as more rural buildings. So, I'm really interested in seeing how this might hopefully inspire more architects to be braver, not just in Nigeria, but in other parts of the continent. And to skip ahead, like I mentioned, this is an area that did was to ensure that any of the existing, right, there's a few interruptions. Advanced and scaled up in this part of, well, certainly in Nigeria, but in many other parts of the global South. And one reason for this is that it's expensive, it's labor intensive, it requires articulating your building sometimes can uncover equipment or even redesign certain elements of your subsurface structure. But it's something that we felt very strongly about doing. And so in partnership with the British Museum and in collaboration with the National Commission for Museums and Monuments, we have engaged in a 4-year program that involves various UK-based and Nigerian practitioners, as well as local communities, into collaborating on construction projects across our campus. So largely driven by where we see the footprint of not just the upcoming Mowaa Institute building, but across the other upcoming structures in the campus. As you can see, this provides huge learning opportunities for graduate practitioners. It's provided a way to think differently about how we marry not just colonial architecture and material heritage, which is actually visible above the surface of the site, with the older forms of architecture. But it also has led to some questions with regards to sometimes seeing evidences of destruction, in particular, things that may allude to the fires of 1897. One of the things that we had also done is not just use this as a training ground for young archaeologists, but also invite members of the community to come to these spaces, to see what archaeology actually looks like in practice, and invite them to interpret alongside with us. And I think this interaction is really what has enriched the conversation around Mowaa within the community. It's also provided a debate within our own teams as to the extent to which we can be culturally sensitive, particularly given the range of different sometimes the tensions between more, I guess, conservative cultural beliefs about burial grounds, around the way in which we treat sacred objects versus the often very structured approach of more scientific methods. So again, bringing various practitioners together, some of whom had never been engaged in this kind of project, bringing in communities was something that was really important for us to demonstrate, even as we're thinking about reshaping the urban landscape here. And this is just a reference to some of the older traditional art forms building forms and structures that, again, we are seeing evidence of even as we are still conducting these archaeological exercises. As I mentioned briefly, what we wanted to do was not just have a one-off archaeological survey, but to actually establish a long-standing archaeological team that would be based at the Mowaa Institute after completion and continue to serve as a point for archaeological work and heritage management promotion in perpetuity, or for as long as we're able to exist and have funding. And it's been incredibly enlightening, not just having the team being on the ground, but also working with other national universities across the country. So we've worked with the University of Benin, with Ahmadu Bello in Zaria, with the University of Nigeria in Nsukka, and of course, University of Ibadan, to bring in final year students across various disciplines, as well as recent graduates, to come and learn from us as we are working together with both UK partners and the National Commission. And one of the things that has been really instructive here was not just having this be a one-off experience of sort of learning in a passive way, but having each of these different student groups go back into their own communities and institutions to find ways to bring heritage to the fore in their own communities. So it's already sparking connections to heritage even beyond Benin City, and hopefully inspiring a new generation of practitioners in this and other related fields. And these are just showing you some other typologies, or should I say models, that we're developing for engagement, that are bringing people into spaces that are what I would call live projects. So really opening up the way we think about construction as something that should only be showcased after the building is done, or even archaeology as research that should only be shared once we've done the full-scale lab analysis. But instead thinking about ways that we can actively and systematically bring in a breadth of practitioners and people from local communities into these spaces. So we have open days. We also have discovery day sessions that are more focused on the archaeology itself. We've also been involved in community tree planting exercises, again, thinking not just about culture, but also about the broader ecological inheritance, learning from communities as to the cultural significance of various indigenous trees, really starting to bring back memories and folklore from that might have been passed on through grandparents, through older members of society, and create points of connection and storytelling experiences within the campus, even as we're thinking about the regeneration of green spaces. So this is part of a wider project that will be across the campus and that will be iterative every year, that is looking at reinstating a rainforest garden, so to speak, within the center of Benin City itself. So again, really trying to think both about sustainability, but also about connection. And I think fourthly, I would just say that when it comes to how in the long term we're looking at supporting artisans, supporting guilds, many of which are still in existence in the city, but perhaps are not thriving in the same way as they would have, partly because of the reduction in patronage. One of the things that I would just, highlight here is that sometimes it's easy to look at restitution from the lens of the looting of objects, and that being the most severe of forms of disruptiveness. But of course, there's the underlying traditions and the intergenerational practices that stem back centuries that were also affected by the the various Eurocentric invasions and exchanges in this part of the world. So in really thinking more holistically about how we are approaching cultural and urban practice, can we find ways, can we push ourselves to develop building and think about new products that could actually be integrated into building forms, so that every year that we are replacing or repairing, that we're giving people jobs. We're providing economic opportunities that could be showcased here, but also, promoted at scale in other parts of the country, and dare I say it, more globally. So I'll just maybe end here by saying that the journey so far has been one that has required us to think quite carefully about how we are being intentional and reflective in our practice, thinking about who gets to decide what should be preserved and how, to what extent can practitioners who traditionally do not consider themselves as being part of a conservation ecosystem be provided channels and opportunities to learn about heritage, but also to support the longer term survival of the heritage that remains. And what would it mean to actually scale this? It's been an interesting exercise in speaking with urban practitioners ranging from architects, civil engineers, landscape architects, builders, many of which have come for training on our site, as well as been involved in the workshopping to make sure that we were actually working in tandem to our how do we do this in a way that also means that we are we're staying on top of our programming when it comes to just being on time with the building, and making sure that we're keeping under cost. And I think this is a challenge, not just for us, but for any industry that seeks to think more consciously about conservation practice. And lastly, I would say that ultimately, for this to really grow at scale, we need to have underpinning policies that can provide an enabling environment for protection, for funding support, for training, that could inspire the kind of social, spatial, and economic change that I think Mowaa and other institutions should stand for. So thank you very much. And I'll hand over back to Bia.
Oh, thank you. This was so inspiring, and it's setting off a lot of questions. So before we hand over to the audience, who I'm sure also has burning questions, there's sort of 3 points I'm taking away that I find quite incredible and really sort of food for thought. So the first one is actually how much this project and sort of in its inception has this hard work of, on the one hand, selling itself to a global audience as a museum in the global museum landscape, as an institution to be visited, as a sort of site for scholarship exchange. But then on the other hand, and I think this is something that is a very fundamental difference, even though museums in the European space, as we know it, also work with the community. But the idea that one also has to convince Nigerians, both in and outside of the intellectual institutions, of the worthiness of such an undertaking. Because, like you said, the destruction is perhaps not the physical destruction of buildings, 1897, but perhaps a sort of slow drip, trip, grind of the sort of assumption that perhaps Nigerian knowledge systems, Nigerian heritage have not been deemed worthy of preserving in the sort of run of trying to compete globally on all levels. So that's a really sort of interesting aspect that many people don't think about first when they're thinking about such projects. The other one, and I'm jumping completely, is the really exciting aspect of the sort of thoughtfulness of the choices to do with the architecture and how to build this location. And this is something that came up in the conversation I had this Monday with, the sort of directors and CEOs of the Yinka Shonibara's Guest Artist Space Foundation in Lagos, where the idea came up that the farm building was being built with bricks that were made in the traditional earthen method, sort of practiced by Yoruba. Again, you have here the sort of very, very distinctive sort of red, muddy earth that is, very, very typical for that region, and how you're sort of resurrecting that in the sort of architectural work that you're doing with multiple practitioners. You're also pointing out that, this is not just work done by Nigerians, but it is an international team of people from different African countries that are coming together with different exposure to sort of global working as well. And then the last point, and I think that's something that keeps coming up, and I think we can never cease to talk about that, is this very fundamental difference of, philosophical approach in thinking about history. You talk about heritage, you talk about heritage preservation and heritage revival, in particular in a sort of wider notion of arts and crafts, because you have the sort of arm of the contemporary, art that's being fostered with very, very, well-known people like Victor Ehikamanor involved in your project from inception, the sort of internationally known post-colonial artists that, Chika Okeke Agulu is mentioning, the people from the Zaria School, Ucho Okeke, etc., that are present in international museums to an extent. But then you have the sort of artisanal, sort of practices that are also still very much alive and continuing, but perhaps, like you said, have not been afforded the sort of care and level of attention that contemporary art forms that sort of blend into the sort of global idea of universal art have been given. And it points to this very non-linear idea of history, where the past is always in the present. That is something that we, in the Eurocentric way of thinking, we are not aware of, and we are not practicing. And I think what you've just pointed out makes that so beautifully clear. So perhaps you could sort of flesh out any one of these points. I'm not expecting you to sort of cover all of it, but that's sort of the takeaway I had from your wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Noah. Those are, I think, really insightful and excellent points. maybe I'll start in the middle, unusually enough. I think that a big part of the advocacy for um, really pushing for a reconnection with more historic or traditional art forms that may not be considered as being, hip or modern, is really something that's being driven by people broadly from the creative fields. So, and I say this broadly not just to refer to people you mentioned, such as Victor Hikameno, who is obviously referencing um, cultural um, historic figures and symbols in his work, but also in terms of even much younger artists like Adeju Thompson, who is actively working with bronze casters in designing textile-based art and I guess works in a more of a fashion context as well. So bringing that again into more popular spaces whereby you are seeing an online audience being able to interact with his work and see where his own inspirations and references come from. And so what we're doing is in some ways just doing taking a leaf from the same book, but doing it on a different scale. So rather than working with just objects, working with an entire 15-acre campus, which not everyone has the privilege of doing. So again, it's about what your starting points are, what sort of tools or resources you have available to you, and a willingness to do the hard work, to do the research, to go where the living heritage and traditions are. I would also say that my more recent experience of being more embedded in Benin as a city has really, I think, driven home the point that what might appear as an event that happened a long time ago, in the sense of 1897, it's still very, very visceral in people's minds. And there's a deep connection to the traditional palace and to the culture and to the various stories, beliefs, practices that are still very, very interwoven into, I think, contemporary culture. So in some ways, we do not have to try hard to forge a connection. The connection exists. And I'll give you one example. We had a really, I think, surprising, a beautiful moment where we had invited a series of market women to come and be part of the tree planting experiences that we were hosting on our campus. And after, sort of going through I guess the rite, the sort of new tradition that we are trying to instill within our own space, the head of the Market Women's Association went up to the Ramdot building and she said, "I know this, I recognize this. This is from my culture, this is from my home." And it's that really beautiful moment where, without having to host a lecture or publish, a series of academic journals, people get it because there's a visible and an emotional connection to what looks like them, to recognizing yourself in the urban landscape, in art, in popular culture, in all of these spaces where we now have more of an opportunity, I think, to articulate how we want to be seen. I've lost a bit of track as to some of the other points you raised, but I think, yeah, just more generally, in terms of maybe balancing the sort of global expectations, especially when it came to the design of the facility of itself, because as you can imagine, it's not a regular building. It's a bunker that is climate control. So you're having to think very hard about the different technologies you're building, you're integrating. How are you going to ensure that we are actually able to get international loans and maintain the same standards, or at least look at a way of recontextualizing and defining those standards in our own context, but in a way that doesn't affect the material integrity of the artworks that we want to be available for generations to come. And doing this in a balance to where we are in this context. One of the things that was, again, aligned quite well was that mud, like earthen architecture in itself, has cooling properties. So by referencing and applying this material, we're actually helping to upgrade the conservation standards of the building itself. And I think there will be many of these points of interventions if you're if we be warming
Yeah, I
things.
think that's becoming very, very clear that, this is no longer about, comparing up to some sort of universalist standard that is determined by a sort of, European mindset or Eurocentric mindset. But what I find interesting as well is, like, you keep saying that you're sort of mentioning this to the people in the surrounding area. And you say that they are recognizing things, but I think it also took a lot of convincing, or takes a lot of convincing, to sort of see the point of, putting so much money into, and architecture and infrastructure that, in a way doesn't sort of have shop space or, sort of other things that are immediately functional. So, and I think that's something that's a difficulty that sort of comes with its location, and with the fact that the cultural expectations being more about sort of trying to facilitate more commerce. And I think that you're being very thoughtful about that, and maybe you can say a little bit more about the sort of very different expectations that come towards a museum in a place such as Benin City, despite the fact that it's in a university city. So
Yeah, sure. I think, first of all, it goes without saying that whilst, yes, there is a deep appreciation for culture in Benin City, it's not typically in Nigeria, you don't have a strong museum going culture. So when people think about where they go to experience culture, the museum is not the first point of contact for a lot of people. It's more in living heritage spaces. It's the weddings you attend where you see it's the naming ceremonies. It's the things that are actually connecting us to our ancestry and reaffirming the traditions that we've inherited from our forefathers, so to speak. So when you think about how you respond to that, I think within the context of museum development, I think one of the things that immediately comes to mind is how do you create these new rights, new ways of connecting people in a way that does not feel as though you have a fixed or static idea of what culture looks like, or what rather heritage looks like, but also that is something that is more experiential. Something that is repeated, that involves a more active use of your body. And I think whether we're talking about tree planting, or whether you were talking about how we're using earth as a material and actually inviting people to be part of, pottery making exchanges, workshops with traditional guilds held on our campus, but also having discussions, having walks, having a more unique experience that feels less stuffy. These are things that I think we need to continuously develop and integrate into how we are developing our visitors' experience. And I think the interesting thing about this is it, I don't think it would be unappealing to a more international audience. I think there's a general uh, hunger for new ways of interaction and interpreting culture that takes people out of their comfort zone, that disrupts notion of what we consider to be high art, um, and also potentially can provide for more collaborations across different disciplines or forms. And that's really what we're trying to do and say here. There of course will be larger conversation as to what that looks like curatorially, and to what extent we can achieve it in the blended display and public programming environments that we are looking to establish over time. But one of the reasons why we are launching the Institute and opening for preview in November this year with the theme Museum in the Making is because this should be something that is an inclusive and iterative process. So we are letting people know that we are not a pristine, fully knotted and bowed institution, but that we are intentionally wanting to leave room for people to tell us and to assert their own selves into the space. And that can be done in a very literal way. So one thing that we are hopefully looking forward to share is an actual workshop where we are taking a more historic practice of potsherd pavements where you would use pretty much recycle old ceramic material and use that in paving the various outdoor spaces. So inviting visitors as well as local residents to do this with us so that they're actually making the campus alongside with us and learning and changing. And it's not a sort of one size fits all, very blanket approach. So yeah, it's definitely shaping up.
Well, it brings me to the contemporary actually, because there is another aspect, which will happen that, there will be future shows of contemporary art. And I mean, that's something that I think our audience is becoming increasingly aware of, because I've also been mentioning it on Monday, but I think also because the press is reporting about it widely. You said earlier that, not everything that you're trying to achieve with revival of heritage is necessarily hip, but the Nigerian art scene is truly hip, and it is everywhere, and that includes people working on the ground in Nigeria, but also people who are part of the diasporic, art scene, who maybe have their feet in two cultures. And that's, I think, that makes this project very, very exciting, is that you're going to get this kind of constant feedback and people like responding to being part of this lineage of heritage, being part of also the fiber of the city, and being part of the kind of fashions that are being created right now in the sort of contemporary program that you're going to be curating there. And there is, quite unusually for a museum that has such a strong, say, heritage and historical sort of weight to carry as well. You have an incredibly sort of future orientated outlook, and that's really, really wonderful. So maybe you could go into that a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the most succinct way to say it is that museums are not for dead things and dead people's things, right? It's for living. It's for the now. And I think that's an important intersection that would really be the lifeline of what Mowaa is able to achieve if we're successful in really putting not just Nigerian, but a Black art, should I say, or African art. There have been various global events, whether you're talking about colonialism and the wave of immigration that it inspired in a more modern age, to darker moments of the continent's history with regards to the transatlantic slave trade. And even if you hearken even further back into deeper history, Africans have always been on the move. So the notion that we are only looking at fixed stories in location, as opposed to really thinking about the connections that we've always had as part of a global conversation and global exchange, for me is another thing that we are looking to bring to the fore. And that's where I think, that's one of the reasons why I think Nigerian contemporary art has been so compelling, because it does have, it's able to resonate with audiences around the world, and it's been able to also take off in places across, places like the US, the UK, where you oftentimes have, more support in terms of gallery representation and whatnot. But in Nigeria, as you mentioned earlier, with the reference to the GAS Foundation or the GAS residency programs, what you're seeing generally is that there's a new push for infrastructure that actually supports contemporary artists on the continent and allows for visiting practitioners to come and learn from what's happening here. And I think what we would like to do is, by running residency programs, by establishing archives that can really expand access to material about antiquities, but also even modern art, which hasn't really, I think, more recently, I think, deserves to be looked at again more closely, and perhaps for the canon to be expanded to include other lesser known artists, female artists, artisans who are using more arts and crafts-based traditions. So again, providing for that in that base that I think will not just create more visibility for the artists that are doing well, but to hopefully inspire and push their practice, while also creating an avenue for people who may not be able to, or may not even indeed want to, relocate abroad to still be successful practitioners on the continent. And that's, I think, really what can be done to complement what we're already seeing happening with platforms like Artex and other galleries that have I think done an incredible job of putting African art in the market.
Absolutely. And I mean, we can tell that you're already inspiring, because we haven't had many questions, because I think everybody's sort of quite wowed by the project. But one question we do have is from Avin Daniel, saying, how can we volunteer for this project? So perhaps if you want to type in an answer on how to contact you, it sounds like you're inspiring people on the ground already. Yeah, so I think that's absolutely super exciting. And I have a feeling that in general, I think the art world, the success of Nigerian artists everywhere at the moment. And yes, as you said, the growth of institutions locally will sort of come together to sort of create a critical mass that will change the way and visibility of, art made on the continent, in the continent, and also being exhibited in Nigeria. So can I just say, on behalf of everyone, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, for the spirit, for sharing the spirit of this project. And I look forward to hearing more, and hopefully I get the chance to see it live myself. So
Thank you so much. This has been an enjoyable conversation, dare I say it. And I'm, looking forward to getting more volunteers in and seeing how people can also inspire us. So thank you very much, everyone. And maybe just one thing to mention for those who do want to know more, we are available at our website. So it's wearemowaa.org. So you'll find all the details there should you wish to contact us in future.
Yes. That's great. It should have been typed into the questionnaire. Well, I think that concludes our presentation for this afternoon. So thank you very much, everyone. And thank you, Ore. It was really fantastic to hear from you.